Hi, everyone. My name is Seraphina, but everyone calls me Sarah. I'm 42 years old, and just over a year ago, I married Jonah, a kind and hard-working man in his mid-40s. Jonah came into our marriage with a son, Kael, who's 22. Kael is a quiet, intelligent young man who moved in with us recently while finishing his degree. Blending our family hasn't been without its challenges, but overall, we've managed to find a rhythm. However, there are some moments in life that you never see coming, moments that change everything. What I'm about to share is one of those times. It all started on a warm, sunny Saturday. Jonah had left early for a weekend work trip, leaving Kael and me alone in the house. I woke up feeling productive and decided to tackle some cleaning. The sunlight streamed through the windows, casting a golden glow over the living room, and my favorite playlist filled the air with upbeat music. Throwing on a tank top and shorts, I tied my hair up and got to work. The house felt peaceful, almost serene. I dusted shelves, adjusted picture frames, and hummed along to the music, completely unaware of what the day had in store. I didn't assume Kael was still asleep. He had a habit of sleeping in on weekends, so I didn't expect anyone to interrupt me. But as I moved to rearrange a stack of books, I felt a shift in the room. Turning around, I saw Kael standing in the doorway. "Good morning, Kael," I greeted him with a smile, though his sudden presence had caught me off guard. "Morning," he replied, his voice quieter than usual. He leaned against the doorframe, his arms crossed, watching me with an expression I couldn't quite decipher. I resumed my cleaning, trying to shake the strange awareness of his gaze. We made small talk. He told me about his classes, his plans for the weekend, but there was something different about the way he spoke. His tone was thoughtful, almost hesitant, and his eyes lingered on me in a way they never had before. At one point, while reaching for a high shelf, I lost my balance. Before I could steady myself, Kael was there, his hands firm on my waist. "You okay?" he asked, his voice tinged with concern. "Oh, yes, thank you," I replied, looking up at him. Our eyes met, and for a brief moment, something passed between us, an unspoken connection that felt both thrilling and unnerving. His hands lingered a second longer before he stepped back, clearing his throat. "Sorry about that," he said. His tone casual, though his expression betrayed a hint of something deeper. "No problem," I managed to say, turning back to my task and pretending everything was normal. The rest of the morning passed with an undercurrent of tension I couldn't ignore. Kael offered to help with the cleaning, and though his presence was helpful, it also added to the strange atmosphere. Every time our hands brushed while passing items back and forth, every time his gaze met mine, the energy between us seemed to build. By the time we finished, the house looked spotless, but I felt like I was holding my breath. "Want to take a break?" I asked, gesturing toward the couch. "Sure," Kael said, his tone lighter now, though there was still something unreadable in his expression. We sat side by side, sipping iced coffee and chatting idly about his classes and future plans. But as the conversation waned, a heavy silence settled between us. I glanced at him, noticing the way his focus seemed to linger on me. "You're quiet today," I said, with a small smile, trying to ease the tension. Kael chuckled softly. "Maybe I'm just seeing things differently today." "What do you mean?" I asked, my heart skipping a beat at his words. He hesitated, as if searching for the right way to explain himself. "I don't know," he said finally. "It's just spending time like this. It feels different, like we're really connecting, not just coexisting." His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. My cheeks flushed as I struggled to think of how to respond. "I get what you mean," I said softly. "It's nice to slow down and just be present." Kael nodded, his gaze steady on mine. "Exactly." The room seemed to shrink around us, the silence between our words growing thicker, more charged. I reached up to tuck a loose strand of hair behind my ear, a nervous habit I couldn't seem to shake. Kael's eyes followed the movement, and before I realized what was happening, his hand brushed against mine. The touch was fleeting, but it sent a jolt through me that I couldn't ignore. "Sera," he said, his voice low and hesitant. "Yes," I replied, my own voice barely above a whisper. He paused, his gaze searching mine. "I don't want to make things awkward, but you mean a lot to me. More than I think I've realized before." His words took my breath away. I stared at him, my pulse racing, as I tried to process what he was saying. "Kael, I started, but the words caught in my throat. He leaned in slightly, his face inches from mine. "You don't have to say anything," he said softly. "I just needed you to know how I feel." For a moment, time seemed to stand still. The world outside faded away, leaving just the two of us in the quiet cocoon of the living room. Kael's footsteps faded as he left the kitchen, but the air between us remained heavy, charged with everything left unsaid. I stood there gripping the edge of the counter, my breathing uneven as I tried to make sense of what had just happened. My pulse raced, my mind a whirlwind of guilt, confusion, and something else. Something I wasn't ready to name. The rest of the weekend passed in a haze of avoidance. Kael stayed in his room most of the time, only emerging when absolutely necessary. When our paths did cross, neither of us spoke more than a few words, and the tension was palpable, like a live wire humming beneath the surface. By the time Jonah returned on Sunday evening, I felt like I was holding my breath, waiting for the inevitable collapse of everything. But Jonah, as usual, was oblivious to the storm brewing under his own roof. He greeted me with a kiss on the cheek and ruffled Kael's hair, as if all was right in the world. That night, as I lay in bed next to Jonah, my mind wouldn't stop racing. Every glance Kael and I had shared, every word, every touch, it all replayed in my head on an endless loop. I tried to push it away, to focus on Jonah, on the life we had built together, but the pull toward Kael was impossible to ignore. The days that followed were agonizing. Kael and I barely spoke, but his presence was impossible to ignore. Every time he walked into a room, my heart would leap into my throat, and I could feel his gaze lingering on me, even when I wasn't looking. One evening, about a week later, Jonah announced he'd be working late on a new project. The moment he left the house, the tension between Kael and me reached a boiling point. I was in the living room trying to distract myself with a book when Kael appeared in the doorway. His expression was guarded, but there was a determination in his eyes that made my pulse quicken. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice quiet but firm. I hesitated, my instinct screaming at me to say no, but I nodded, setting the book aside. "Okay," I said softly. He stepped into the room, sitting down on the edge of the couch, careful to leave some space between us. For a moment, neither of us spoke, the silence stretching unbearably. "I'm sorry," he said finally, his voice heavy with regret. "I never meant to make things complicated for you." I looked at him, my heart aching at the vulnerability in his expression. "It's not just you," I admitted. "I'm just as much at fault. But we can't keep doing this, Kael. It's not right." "I know," he said, his hands gripping his knees, "but I can't stop how I feel." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. I wanted to tell him I felt the same, that the pull between us was as overwhelming for me as it was for him, but I couldn't. I couldn't say it out loud, couldn't give those feelings any more power than they already had. "We have to stop this," I said firmly, though my voice wavered. "For Jonah, for this family. Whatever this is, it has to end." Kael nodded slowly, his jaw tight. "I get it," he said, his voice low. "I'll do my best to stay out of your way." He stood, and for a moment I thought he might leave, but then he turned back, his eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that made my breath catch. "Just tell me one thing," he said. "Do you feel it too, or am I just imagining things?" I froze, the weight of his question settling over me. I wanted to deny it, to tell him he was wrong, but I couldn't lie. Not to him. Yes, I whispered, my voice barely audible. I feel it too. For a moment, neither of us moved. The air between us thick with everything we weren't saying. Then slowly, Kael took a step closer, his eyes searching mine for any sign of hesitation. What a glorious day, talked the door knocker below, and home for Gabriel, with welcome and a nice hug, on my way. Kael, don't, I said, but my words lacked conviction. He closed the distance between us, his hand reaching for mine. The warmth of his touch sent a shiver down my spine, and I felt myself leaning toward him despite every alarm bell in my head screaming at me to stop. But just as his lips brushed against mine, the sound of the front door unlocking shattered the moment. The sound of the door unlocking sent a jolt through both of us. I jumped back, my heart pounding, as if it might burst out of my chest. Kael froze, his hand still lingering mid-air where it had been reaching for me. His eyes wide with panic. Jonah walked in moments later, oblivious to the scene he had nearly interrupted. "Hey, you two," he called out cheerfully, setting his briefcase down by the door. "Smells like someone's been cooking. What's for dinner?" Kael and I exchanged a glance, the tension between us so thick it felt like it might suffocate me. I was just about to start something, I stammered, my voice shaky. Jonah didn't seem to notice. He kissed me on the cheek, his familiar, easygoing smile only amplifying the guilt tearing through me. Kael cleared his throat, standing rigidly by the couch. "I'll go finish some work," he muttered, brushing past Jonah and disappearing down the hall. Jonah raised an eyebrow. "What's with him?" "Probably stressed about school," I replied quickly, forcing a smile. "You know how he gets." Jonah shrugged, seemingly satisfied with the explanation, and headed to the kitchen. I followed mechanically, my mind racing with everything that had just transpired. Over the next few days, Kael and I kept our distance. But the tension was always there, lurking just beneath the surface. Every stolen glance, every accidental touch felt like a spark waiting to ignite the fire we were both desperately trying to extinguish. One evening, Jonah mentioned he'd be attending a work retreat out of town for a full week. My stomach twisted at the news, knowing what his absence might mean. Kael and I had been teetering on the edge for weeks, and I wasn't sure if we had the strength to pull ourselves back. When the week finally came, the house felt impossibly quiet after Jonah left. I spent the first 2 days avoiding Kael, throwing myself into errands and chores, anything to keep myself busy. But on the third evening, fate intervened. The power went out during a storm, plunging the house into darkness. I was lighting candles in the living room when Kael appeared holding a flashlight. "You okay?" he asked, his voice low and concerned. "Yeah, just a little startled," I admitted, my hands trembling slightly. He stepped closer, the flashlight casting shadows across his face, highlighting the intensity in his eyes. "This storm's pretty bad. Maybe we should stay in the same room, just in case." I nodded, unable to find the words to protest. The storm outside mirrored the turmoil inside me, and I felt the walls closing in. We sat on the couch in the flickering candlelight, the silence between us heavy with unspoken words. "Sarah," he said after a long pause, his voice breaking through the tension, "I don't know how much longer I can keep pretending this doesn't exist." I turned to him, my breath catching in my throat. "Kael, we can't." "It not?" he interrupted, his tone more urgent now. "We're adults. We know what we are feeling. Why should we keep lying to ourselves?" "Because it's wrong," I said, though my voice wavered. "Because Jonah trusts us. Because this would destroy everything." He leaned closer, his eyes locking onto mine with a fire that made it impossible to look away. "But what about us, Sarah? What about what we want? Doesn't that matter?" Tears welled in my eyes as I shook my head. "It's not that simple, Kael. It never will be." For a moment, we just stared at each other, the storm raging outside as the silence stretched between us. And then, without warning, he kissed me. The kiss was desperate, filled with all the emotions we had been suppressing for so long. I tried to resist, to push him away, but the pull was too strong. For those few moments, nothing else mattered. But the guilt hit me like a tidal wave as I pulled back, my hands shaking. "We can't do this," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. "This has to stop." Kael looked at me, his own eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I'll go," he said quietly, his voice breaking. "I'll leave. If that's what it takes to make this right, I'll go." His words shattered something inside me. I wanted to beg him to stay, to tell him we could figure it out, but I knew he was right. The only way to save what was left of my marriage, of my family, was to let him go. The next morning, Kael packed his bags and left. Jonah was confused and upset. Jonah was confused and upset, but Kael told him he had decided to stay on campus for the remainder of his studies. I watched from the doorway as Kael's car disappeared down the street, my heart breaking with every mile he put between us. In the weeks that followed, I tried to rebuild my life with Jonah, but the distance between us was undeniable. Kael's absence was a constant reminder of what had happened, of what I had lost. And though I knew it was for the best, a part of me couldn't help but wonder what might have been if things had been different.